Greetings, friends, and welcome to this intergenerational webinar conversation with past and current directors of CCIA to mark the 75th anniversary of the Commission of the Churches on International Affairs of the World Council of Churches. We will start this webinar with some opening remarks by Reverend Professor Dr. Ioan Sauca. He is the World Council of Churches Acting General Secretary. A priest of the Orthodox Church in Romania, he has served as professor at the Ecumenical Institute of Posse since 1998 and as its director since 2001. Before his appointment as acting general secretary in April 2020, he served as deputy general secretary since 2014. He earned his PhD in theology at the University of Birmingham, UK. Father Sauca.
Thank you, Sigma. Dear sisters and brothers in Christ, warm greetings to all of you. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this intergenerational webinar conversation, marking 75 years of ecumenical prophetic witness in international affairs, through a dialogue with past and present directors of the Commission of the Churches on International Affairs, CCIA, of the World Council of Churches. Exactly 75 years ago, during the summer of 1946, in Cambridge, United Kingdom, a conference of church leaders from 16 countries met and created the Commission of the Churches on International Affairs. They met at a time of history when the international order was in ruins after one of the most destructive wars the world has ever known. Acknowledging the brokenness of the world, and while parallel discussions to create a World Council of Churches were well underway, participants of the summer 1946 Cambridge meeting felt an urgent need to establish a commission that would bring the prophetic witness of the ecumenical family into the field of international affairs. This is how the first director of CCIA, Frederick Nold, was able to be at the table of drafters of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the foundational instrument of modern international human rights law. We are especially grateful to him for his substantive contribution to Article 18 on freedom of religion or belief, which states that it is everyone's fundamental right to hold one's own belief, to have a religion, to change it, or to have no religion. This time, this article was transformational because it stipulates that all people shall have equal rights to hold and practice their belief in peace and without discrimination, and that their rights in this regard shall be guaranteed by the state. The mandate of CCIA is broad, covering a wide spectrum of issues in the field of international affairs, from human rights and fundamental freedoms, to peace building and disarmament, to economic and environmental justice. During the last 75 years, the various directors that led CCIA have striven to advance the mandate of the Commission to, and I call the attention of churches to problems which are especially claimant upon the Christian conscience, serving as a medium of counsel and action and as an organ in formulating the Christian mind on the old issues and bringing that mind effectively to bear upon such issues. They have striven to ensure ecumenical unity and cooperation in action on all these challenges. Today's webinar is therefore an opportunity to hear from past and current CCIA directors about some of the achievements and challenges of the past 7 decades, and to reflect on how the ecumenical family has reacted and positioned itself in international affairs over the 3/4 of a century. The discussion will also be an opportunity to envision how the voice of the ecumenical fellowship can shape and address current and future global challenges, such as the climate emergency, the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, resurgent racial discrimination and xenophobia, and the continuing struggle for gender equality. Therefore, in the end, I hope you enjoy the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Father Sauka. During this webinar, we will have a panel composed of former and current CCIA directors who will be in conversation with past and current CCIA commissioners, as we said previously. So before we start this conversation, allow me to briefly take you through the various directors that led this commission during the last 7+ decades, some of whom unfortunately are not with us today. The very first director of CCIA was Dr. Frederick Nolde. He served from 1946 to 1968, 22 years. He was a Lutheran from the US. He was then succeeded by Mr. Leopoldo Nilus, a Lutheran from Argentina, who served from 1969 to 1981 for 12 years. He was the second director. Professor Dr. Nainan Koshi from the Church of South India was the third CCIA director. He served during 10 years from 1981 to 1991. Then we had Reverend Charles Harper from the Presbyterian Church USA, from Brazil and US, a dual citizen, who served as interim directors for 2 years, from 91 to 93. He was then followed by Reverend Dwayne Epps, who we have on our panel today, also from the Presbyterian Church USA, who was director from 1993 to August 2002, 9 years. Thank you for being with us, Dwayne. Reverend Epps was then succeeded by Mr. Peter Weiderud from the Church of Sweden, who assumed the role of director from 2002 to 2006. And he's with us today also on the panel. Thank you for being with us, Peter. Then we had Mr. Clement John from the Church of Pakistan, who was acting director between August 2006 to March 2007 for less than a year. After that, he was followed by Reverend Eleonora Giddins Ivory, the only woman in this position, actually. And she's from the Presbyterian Church USA, and she served from November 2007 to June 2009. Then she was succeeded by Dr. Matthews George Chunakara from the Mar Thoma Syrian Church in India. And he was a CCIA director from July 2001 for 5 years until July 2014. And finally, we have today also on the panel, Mr. Peter Proof, Lutheran from Australia, who is the current CCIA director, and he has been serving since May 2014. The directors present today will be interviewed by former and current CCIA commissioners. And we have the privilege of having today, Reverend Sephyuta Halalaapi Api from the Anglican Diocese of Polynesia, from Fiji, and it's very late in Fiji right now, so thank you, Sepi, for being with us. Dr. Thomas Kank from the Evangelical Lutheran Church Confession in Brazil, And he also served as a youth commissioner at the same time as Reverend Seppi from 2006 to 2013. We have Deacon Adebayo Anthony Kehinde from the Church of the Lord Worldwide Nigeria. He's a current CCIA Youth Commissioner since 2014. And we have Melisande King Chaval Shifter from the EKD. She's both German and Thai, and she's also serving as a current CCIA Youth Commissioner since 2014. In order to save time, because we only have 90 minutes for this very important conversation, I will be sharing in the chat room the bios of all the directors and commissioners who are present on our panel today. Therefore, without any further delay, I invite our commissioners to lead us in this intergenerational conversation. Thomas, we start with you.
Good morning. Let's go to the first section, which is about church, CCIA, and international affairs. So, over the last 75 years, the geopolitical dynamics changed greatly. The bipolar world that followed the end of the World War II was replaced in the late 1980s, early 1990s, by the end of the Cold War. Consequently, the geopolitical patterns also evolved with an increasing number of internal conflicts, the need to protect internally displaced people and contain refugee flows resulting from these civil wars, an increasing erosion of sovereignty, etc. CCIA being the political instrument of the WCC and the ecumenical movement, how would you directors say the role of CCIA has evolved over these last 7 decades? How do you say was the relationship between churches and intergovernmental organizations when you were serving as CCIA director?
Dwayne, we start with you.
Yes, thank you. Thomas, thank you very much for that introduction. 3 minutes. Nobody ever accused me of talking for 3 minutes only. But let me say briefly that the major change in CCIA took place in 1968 when so many things were happening in the world and so many changes were occurring. There was a new director appointed after the long tenure of the first director. Leopoldo Nilus was a lawyer from Argentina who gathered a new generation of staff. And that new focus, it was particularly focused on human rights and on a program called Human Rights and Christian Responsibility. CCIA engaged the churches in a global reconsideration of their role in a world awakening to the realities of racism and apartheid, the demands of independence movements in countries occupied by colonial powers, the proliferation of brutal military dictatorships in Latin America and Asia, the growing gap between rich and poor around the world. In short, the widespread violation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, to which the WCC and the CCIA had contributed decades earlier. And there was a clear shift of emphasis from diplomacy in the halls of the United Nations to the mobilization of churches in solidarity with one another to defend the victims of gross violations of human rights. Member churches and national and regional ecumenical bodies established human rights programs. National and regional ecumenical conferences were held, and networks of solidarity were established and funded, especially in defense of political prisoners and those at risk of violence at the hands of brutal military and police forces, often financed, trained, and armed by foreign powers. Work at the UN continued, nevertheless, by the CCIA, but it took on a new sense of urgency. CCIA cooperated with other major international NGOs like the International Commission of Jurists and Amnesty International to establish new international norms for the prohibition of torture, forced disappearance, and other atrocities of military dictators. That was my 3 minutes.
Then Peter Redroot.
Thank you, Dwayne, and thank you so much. I would like to focus on one particular event and how I see that as an example of a period of change during my time. Early in 2003, member churches in the Middle East approached us with an appeal that the World Council of Churches should work to stop the US-led invasion of Iraq, which was building up at that time. An invasion, they argued, would create a polarization which will hurt the Christians in the region with violence, displacement, and shrinking space for a long time. We worked hard during some intensive weeks in the CCIA, and we managed to mobilize all 345 member churches at the time, including those in the US and the UK, to speak up from the leaders against the invasion as being immoral, illegal, and ill-advised. And a similar message came from the Roman Catholic Church. This message represented a new approach from the CCIA. We spoke with the member churches, not only to them or on their behalf. And this was possible thanks to new technology at the time. The new technology was email. It was also an escalation of a more direct involvement of member churches and agencies in international affairs and with international institutions, particularly the UN. CCIA could not claim monopoly on the UN relations anymore. The WCC was not prepared that technological change would make competitors of our own constituency. And I believe we went through some tough years during those years. I still believe that more direct involvement of the member churches and agencies is a huge asset, but it takes a somewhat different approach from the CCIA compared to the first 50, 60 years. We must be more of a coordinator. And two points that I take with me from this experience is, first, we must be faithful to the ecumenical reflection. National churches and agencies are more sensitive to contextual political trends. And the difference between the mainland ecumenical and Catholic churches and the evangelical congregational churches in the US in 2003 is a very strong example of that. While one group was opposing, the other provided public backing for that war. The second learning is that we must be faithful to our policies. The reflection CCIA started on responsibility to protect, R2P, in light of the Balkan War just a few years before my time, was a serious dialogue between the peace church tradition and the more mainland just war influenced churches. That was operational during the UN summit, UN Reform Summit in 2005, but almost forgotten a few years later at the WCC Peace Convocation in Jamaica in 2011. Today, after the Western collapse and failure in Afghanistan, that reflection is needed to prevent the international community from retreating to passivity in relation to human protection. We have an asset that we need to bring back to the table. Thank you.
Reverend Gibbons Ivory, please. You're muted, Reverend.
Zoom, as we all do. I thought I would remember that. I was not with the CCIA during this period of the 1980s and the 1990s, so I'll leave time for those who came to this position before me to respond more specifically to that part of this question. I will say that my experience in general is that the churches did as much as possible to be collaborative with other NGOs, non-governmental organizations, as we navigated through the human rights issues in our interface with the world governments. But as you just heard Peter say, we have always taken responsibility and seriously the responsibility to protect others. I will say more in my response to the other questions as they come up. Thank you.
Thank you, George, please.
Yes, well, thank you, my predecessors, those who have already contributed. The issues related or addressed by CCIA during the first several years. The time when I took over the directorship in 2009, this was actually the post-Busan period where even CCIA has undergone some structural radical change with regard to programmatic thrusts. That was the time that the CCIA Commission was expanded with more program areas, including Diaconian development, then Justice and Peace Concerns, JPIC, advisory group, and also the interreligious dialogue program, which is part of CCIA. In that way, number of issues we had to address during those days. We know that those issues, those new programs and programmatic areas, the CCIA had been addressing number of concerns at different levels, at government levels, then UN and related multilateral or intergovernmental organizations level. That includes UN Human Rights Commission, then the UN High Commission for Refugees, then UN First Committee, then United Nations Disarmament Commission and the Geneva-based Conference on Disarmament, and also a number of offices of special rapporteurs dealing with religious freedom, then a rapporteur on children, trafficking in person, then extrajudicial executions, all these issues, and also certain specific country situations we had to address those days. Those country situations include North Korea and Cambodia. And as Peter Widerud has mentioned about the International Ecumenical Peace Convocation, of course, that was one of the main focus or areas of our work during that particular period. Actually, the Decade to Overcome Violence program was integrated as part of the CCA Commission's work. Eventually, the culmination of that particular event that was happened in Jamaica, the IEPC, and also the Just Peace Declaration, all those things happened during that particular period. And during that particular period that we had initiated this special program, peace and security related issues and studies focusing on peace and security in Latin America, peace and security in Asia, and peace and security in Africa. These three major continents, peace and security issues were addressed. And the second time in the history of CCIA Commission that we were able to address the issue related with the freedom of religion in several countries, specific countries, and there was a specific working group also was functioning at that time to address this concern. And also the issues related with the statelessness and stateless people, that also was initiated as part of CCIA Commission's program priorities that I will explain later when we will have more time. So I stop here.
Please, Peter Proof.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Well, the main thing that I would like to add is that the world, and therefore the ecumenical movement, now faces global challenges of an entirely different magnitude and consequence. The COVID-19 pandemic, and especially the climate emergency, as has been mentioned by Father Salka. And in this context, any separation between peace building, disarmament, especially nuclear disarmament, human rights, climate action, environmental protection, and economic justice is unsustainable. Everything is connected. The mandate of CCIA had indeed, as Matthews has just mentioned, been expanded to cover a number of other areas, not only peace building, disarmament, refugees, and human rights, but also, amongst others, environmental and economic justice issues. Currently, the secretariat activities that take place under the auspices of CCIA increasingly operate in the interconnections between these various issues. For example, much of our advocacy work calling for further ratifications of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons is now being undertaken in human rights forums. The UN has in recent years, since I'm asked to comment about the relationships with intergovernmental organizations as well, the UN has in recent years become increasingly open to partnerships with faith-based organizations and communities, and we have many good and closely engaged partners in the UN system. Currently, especially with UNICEF on the implementation of the Church's commitments to children, with UNHCR on the elimination of statelessness, with UNAIDS on HIV/AIDS prevention, care, and related stigma, with WHO on issues related to COVID-19, and with UNEP and UNFCCC on climate and environmental issues. And of course, we are very present and active in the UN human rights forums and processes. The instrument created in the post-World War II period to facilitate global cooperation on such global issues, the United Nations, has been weakened, though, in the meantime, by rising populist nationalism, as well as by its own failings. But it is the best and the only instrument available for global cooperation. At the time CCIA was founded, the issue was how to design a viable and inclusive system of international governance. Now, the challenge is to restore support for and engagement in multilateral cooperation at a time when it is most threatened, but also most needed. Thank you.
Yes, my name is Adebayo Anthony. I would like to start by asking the PCC has over the last 3 decades supported civil liberation movements and decolonization processes in Africa and other parts of the world, and particularly through its program to combat racism. As a Nigerian, I'll be interested to learn a bit about how CCIA engaged with the Biafra war in Nigeria at that time.
Thank you very much for that question. This is one of the most complicated things that I think the World Council has had to deal with in the post-war period. And one of the signals of how complicated the process of decolonization was going to become in the years after the UK, after Great Britain left Nigeria. We're getting some examples of that these days in Afghanistan with another colonial power. I think I will restrain myself from saying anything more, except to read from a statement that on Canberra and the former Eastern region that was issued by the WCC Central Committee in August of 1969. It was prepared by the CCIA. And it made reference to the complications of how the use of aid, and particularly Christian aid or church-related aid agencies, could make things. The Central Committee said, while recognizing that all aid programs appear to have political implications, the proper intention of Christians in giving as much aid as possible to the victims of the two sides of the conflict is simply to express their solidarity with their fellows in their suffering and to do what is possible to bring relief to their needs. In order to secure the most effective use of resources, and in order to prevent the avoidable entanglement of the relief program in political ends, regular consultative meetings of all of the organizations concerned must be encouraged and developed without delay. The only answer to this terrible situation is the ending of the fighting and the achievement of a negotiated settlement. We welcome the efforts of all of those working for this purpose. For its part, the WCC desires to put itself in a position where those seeking peace can turn to it for any help it can offer in resolving the profound disagreement of the two sides. That was the end of the Central Committee's statement in 1969. And it seems to me that in view of the current situation, not just in Afghanistan, but looking at different places in Northern Africa, these considerations are perfectly fitting and give guidance to what we might be able to do today.
Thank you, Dwayne. Still on the question of liberation movement, I'm interested to know about how the CCIA over the past 7 decades supported liberation efforts in the Pacific as well. If we take, for example, the case of French Polynesia, it is finally back on the UN list of non-self-governing countries after being removed from the list in 1948. Could you say a bit more about CCIA's contribution to this regard?
Sorry. I would say that the CCIA has spent or invested its time and energy for some time to address the concerns and issues in the Pacific. We know that in the Pacific, still there are 3 non-self-governing territories existing now as per the UN list out of the 17 non-self-governing territories that still remain on the agenda of the UN. So the CCIA was actually involved in extending support to the Pacific people's struggle and their aspirations for decolonizations. We can take a number of examples, starting from 1982 onwards. That was prior to the Vancouver Assembly. As part of the Vancouver Assembly preparations, that the CCIA took the initiatives to address the concerns of political and economic non-self-governing territories in the Pacific. Especially at that time, WCC was concerned with the quality of life of the overall effects of radiation on the lives of the people in the Marshall Islands. This was mainly or specifically due to the strategic weapon tests during that time. Then the plight of the indigenous people, that was also highlighted during that time. Again, all these issues were highlighted as part of the resolutions adopted by the Vancouver Assembly in 1983. And the Vancouver Assembly provided actually the opportunity to hear the personal and the collective testimonies of the people coming from the Pacific and their plights. And of course, based on that only, finally, the Vancouver Assembly decided to adopt that resolution. That actually drew the attention of the global ecumenical family and the churches across the world. And in that way, it was decided to address these concerns of these unresolved this problem, the right to self-determination, and also the independence of the Melanesian people and the people of New Caledonia, and also in French Polynesia. So you raised the question here that specifically about the issues related with French Polynesia. Well, it was true that finally, now French Polynesia is back on the list. It was actually taken out from the UN list in 1948, as you rightly pointed out. In 2011, that president of Tahiti or French Polynesia, Oscar Tamaro, specifically requested the World Council of Churches through the Pacific Conference of Churches and its member churches in the Pacific, that the World Council of Churches and especially its CCIA Commission should take certain initiatives to extend support for their advocacy with regard to the right to self-determination of the French Polynesia, and also we should take the initiative to support their advocacy on re-inscription of French Polynesia on the UN list of territories not yet decolonized. So in 2012, that when I, as the director, decided to take a delegation to the French Polynesia, and then we did have various kinds of meetings with the government and the president and the opposition leaders of the country, and also the members of the parliament. There are certain parliament members, those who are serving in the French parliament. I remember the important and the dynamic role played during the time by our former colleague, John Doom. John, who is no more. At that time, John Doom was the one who was specially taking the initiative to get the attention of the WCC through the CCIA Commission. Well, a deep concern was expressed at that time on the suppression of the pro-independent movement in French Polynesia. Of course, WCC tried to highlight this issue in various ways through the UN Human Rights Commission in Geneva. Then they informed us and they requested us that they needed certain support for going to New York, and especially to meet with some of the diplomats there to present their cases with regard to re-inscription to the list of the territories to be decolonized. That was the first step of the advocacy of self-determination that we were able to support during that time. Then subsequently, the CCIA assisted and accompanied the Pacific churches and the Pacific church leaders and civil society organization leaders to go to New York, and also to again to attend certain non-governmental NGO related meetings there, and also they traveled to Paris, especially to meet with some of these parliamentarians there. That was our contribution during that time. Starting from the period 2011 to 2014, I would say that the CCIA Commission could extend those kinds of supports and accompaniment to the people in the Pacific on the request of the churches and the Pacific Conference of Churches, and also the French Polynesian governments, and especially the President Maori during that time.
Thank you very much, Matthews. Now, I want to start going back a little bit in time. When I began my mandate on the Commission, the theme of the General Assembly back then in Busan was God of life, lead us to justice and peace. Both of these notions have really moved into focus in our societies, particularly since last year's Black Lives Matter protest made it very clear that no justice, no peace. And when we as a world witnessed the killing of George Floyd at the hands of police officers on May 25th, 2020, that caused a surge in anti-racist activism across the world. There have been protests that took place in more than 60 countries around the world, fighting anti-Blackness and advocating the basic principles of social justice. And for people of faith and people in church, For us, this social unrest has also really ignited the debate about the role and responsibility of churches in perpetuating itself systems of exclusion, white supremacy, white saviorism, and the legacy of colonialism. In Europe, where I am based, people of color have shared their experiences in a message called Dear White Church. Now I'd like to turn to you, Reverend Giddings-Ivory. It is, first of all, my great honor to actually share this virtual space with you. And I hope you allow me to learn from you. Where did you see churches become complicit in perpetuating systemic inequalities? And how is particularly the CCIA uniquely positioned to address that and to advance social justice?
Wow, this is a very loaded question. And it would raise the hairs and the hackles of those who believe the churches didn't do anything at all to perpetuate the systemic inequalities in the world. But then we all know better. If we acknowledge that there were in our churches that perpetuated the erroneous information that some of us are lesser people than others of us are. They do not even know our Bible, and they don't understand that the Bible tells us that we're all equally created in the eyes of God. This nation where I live and where I was born and been here 7 generations or so, this nation was founded under the principle of manifest destiny, or the Doctrine of Discovery. Those are 2 interesting documents and principles that you might want to look at. That even though there were indigenous people, indigenous populations here, the Europeans came. The Europeans came and they displaced the inhabitants based on their understanding of what they claim was their God-given right to ownership of the land and ownership of peoples. So yes, there was a perpetuation of systemic inequalities. This past Sunday, I preached from the New Testament letter of James, chapter 2, where we are given the warning against partiality that is based on wealth or status. We are reminded that Jesus tells us that we are to love neighbor as we love ourselves. Our churches have continued to do this across all United States administrations. They continue to perpetuate some of the inequalities against some of our people. It's sometimes harder to be against justice when there is a friendly administration. After an election, it is a matter of whether we are to be put on the offensive to protect justice policies, such as voting rights, or put on the defensive for justice policies we might have won in the past. The message of the Gospel of Matthew, for instance, must remain the same regardless of which party the government is in power. We are challenged to feed the hungry and clothe the naked, welcome the stranger, and set free the wrongfully captive. As churches, we must not only tell our governments to hear our words of advocacy, but to follow the words of God as they carry out their responsibility as world leaders. Matthew 25 tells the nations that they are to be judged by the way they treat the least of these among us. Frederick Douglass, one of the celebrated civil rights leaders known throughout the world, said that, in effect, injustice concedes nothing without a struggle. Jesus knew that, so we must also demonstrate that. Thank you for hearing me.
Thank you very much, Reverend. I'd like to stay on that topic a little bit and build on what my brother Adebayo already mentioned. There has been a very historic moment and contribution of the ecumenical movement through its program to combat racism and its support to the churches of South Africa against the apartheid regime. Dwayne, allow me to turn to you. What was the role of CCIA in that work and in addressing racial justice? And maybe building on what we just discussed with Reverend Giddings-Ivory, what is it that we can learn from this today as churches need to address their past and present structures of racial injustice?
Thank you for the question. The CCIA was, of course, from the very beginning, a partner of the program to combat racism, particularly in relationship to presenting the positions of the World Council to the United Nations Human Rights Commission, to the General Assembly on a regular basis, and to keep the voice of the churches of the ecumenical movement in the forefront with respect to the situation of apartheid in South Africa. I don't think I can say more about that than that at the moment with regard to South Africa. But with respect to another dimension of the work of the PCR, we did play a role in opening the door for connections with indigenous peoples movements, particularly in North America, by accompanying the leader of the indigenous peoples movement in Canada to the United Nations in pursuit of registration as a non-governmental organization and consultative status there. And they followed up on that, and it has been a useful instrument for them. With respect to the future, I can only laud what has been done by the CCIA in the last couple of years in this respect. For quite a long while, I feared that the gains of the program to combat racism had been ignored. But in the last 2 or 3 years, the CCIA has, with SEGMA's leadership, provided wonderful opportunities for the ecumenical movement, widely understood, to assist in the process of solidarity in situations like those that Reverend Giddings Ivory has described, particularly through the pastoral visit of an ecumenical delegation to the United States, visiting churches there, listening to the churches, and then echoing back to the churches what they heard and saw during that visit. And in the period since then, repeated activities with respect to the UN Human Rights Commission to bring to the attention of the international community from a legal point of view, the situation of the United States, and by implication of racism and discrimination in all different parts of the world. So I'm really very grateful for that and encourage its continuation.
Thanks, Dwayne. I have a question for Reverend Giddings Ivory. Speaking about diversity and inclusion, as the only woman and Afro-descendant who has held a position of CCIA director, what would be your message to future generations of ecumenists?
But I would hope that future generations of ecumenists would accept the leadership of women and those of African descent, that those people accept with respect and trustworthiness. Believe the Bible. God created both men and women in God's image. You can find the woman Deborah in the Old Testament book of Judges, handing out inspirational judgments for peaceful solutions among the people who came to her for solutions to the disputes. Why can't women sit as judge on our religious and secular tribunals now? Jesus acknowledged the presence of women at places like the well getting water from the Samaritan woman. Jesus did not shun women. The Apostle Paul sent Phoebe out to preach and establish churches. Why can't we do the same? Why can't we do that now? Are we second guessing what Jesus or the Apostle Paul did and deny the place of women and continuing to not allow them to be in leadership positions? My message to the next woman or African descended person is to always be mindful that you are a child of God and created in God's image, even though others around you may not see that wisdom, even God's wisdom. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, panelists and commissioners and directors. And let's take a few minutes of Q&A. There are several questions that we see in the chat room. I will go through the questions and I will ask the directors to pick the question that they would like to answer, since we have a short Q&A section. So we have a very first question by Guillermo Kerber, who is saying, would someone further expand on ecumenical and interfaith collaboration at the international arena in a situation when many Christian churches are experiencing critical situations and Islamophobia is rising in many places? Then we have Jack Borlardo from the Philippines, attending very late, saying, any thoughts on intergenerational, international and ecumenical approach to address the pandemic and basic human rights to health and medical treatment? The next decade, I believe, is calling out united action to beating the pandemic and our effective collaborative response to saving as many lives in the ecumene. We also have a question from Youssef Daher in Palestine. Very honored with this dear group of CCIA leaders. My question, what are the areas of focus of CCIA for the period between the upcoming General Assembly in Germany and the next General Assembly? Is it decided before the Assembly or during or after? Also in the chat room, we have a question from former Commissioner Monica Vincent. She's asking, most timely panel in this session. Such credible leadership of CCIA directors, what is the take on tackling power, privilege, and patriarchy that is at the root of inequality and discrimination? How can we begin the work in our churches? Also from one of our former commissioners from Australia, John Langmore, a new arms race is underway, which threatens human survival. How can the CCIA traditional support for arms control and disarmament be renewed? And I think that's what I see. Oh, yes. And we have also a question from our current moderator of CCIA, Reverend Dr. Frank Chicane. The church tends to be a child of its time. That is, it tracks the trajectory of the thinking of its time. To what extent has the CCIA been able to get the church be what it should be beyond the thinking of societies of its time since 1946? And I think, well, and we have Nishad Isaac asking, how can CCIA work to ensure a secure and safe spiritual space for people of other gender identities all over the world? I think we have a lot of questions coming up more and more. So maybe directors, if you could pick a question and each one of you take turn to answer some of these questions before we go to the second phase of the webinar. Thank you. Can we start maybe with Dwayne? If you can unmute yourself, please. Dwayne, if you can unmute yourself, we can't hear you.
I would prefer that the current director would speak to the situation on the future of the CCIA, and particularly in relationship to the forthcoming assembly.
Are there any other questions you would like to address from all those that I've read?
Not immediately for the moment, but I'll keep in mind.
No problem. Peter Prof, then, you've been invited to answer a question or two if you would like.
Wow, those were some massive questions. Every single one of them deserves a webinar in its own right. So I can only do at best rough justice to any of them, but I'll try and combine a few things. First of all, to the simplest and most discreet, as to the next focuses of CCIA, this will be a function of the discussions that take place during the assembly and the way in which that those discussions are distilled in the subsequent reflections of the central committee that is convened thereafter. But I can say with relative certainty that the major global challenges that we've all been speaking about recently, including in particular the climate emergency, the recovery from the pandemic, which will be a long-term project, will be among them for sure. Mention was made of the new arms race, and that certainly refers to the elimination of some of the existing or previous controls on, for example, nuclear weapons as the most dangerous and catastrophic weapon system we have. But also I'd like to mention in this context the need to preempt a new arms race based on lethal autonomous weapon systems or killer robots. Certainly CCIA, and I don't just mean staff, I mean the commissioners themselves, have been very, very actively engaged in addressing the challenge of nuclear weapons to preempt the further proliferation of nuclear weapons by this new treaty for the prohibition of all nuclear weapons. And this is our main focus in this domain going forward. But we're also closely engaged in the campaign to stop killer robots and hoping to achieve, with the support and partnership of our civil society partners, a preemptive ban on such weapons systems. I'd like to link an issue of multilateralism, which was raised actually in the chat by our colleague Nathan Day-Wilson, and the COVID-19 question. I think it's now trite wisdom to observe that the world, the international community, has been tested and found wanting in its response to the global pandemic. And it has shown the weakness of commitment to multilateral cooperation, even in the face of such a self-evident need for global cooperation. We have a lot of work to do to address not only the consequences of the pandemic, but what it has illustrated to us of our failure to cooperate. And then finally, I would just like to say, across many, many different issues and different communities, our fundamental commitment is one of non-discrimination, of lifting up continuously the equal God-given dignity of every person, regardless of any of the characteristics on which people choose to discriminate. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Peter Weiderud, maybe some comments on some of the questions?
I agree with Dwayne that these are a fantastic set of questions, and we really need to go deep into everyone. Maybe a quick comment. What I thought was a question from Guillermo. I'm not sure exactly if I heard it right, but the growing tension between Christians and Muslims is, of course, a particular concern for us, and we need to attend it. I observed during my time that there was a huge difference on the reaction in countries where there was a solid structure of interreligious dialogue and interreligious communication. For example, in West Africa, where some countries had these structures, others had not. They all suffered from incident. There was a desecration of a cemetery, or there was a burning of a church, or an insult of an imam, or something like that. And when you did not have a structure, there was a tendency for religious leaders to put fuel on the conflict by getting involved in the tension that was created. But where you had a structure, there was instead an incitement to calm down, to talk to each other, to find a common approach and a common response. So I think one of the best investments we can do as an ecumenical structure is really to promote structures for interreligious dialogue, solid structures where religious leaders come together and get to learn from each other.
Thank you, Peter. Reverend Ivory Giddens, any comment? If you can unmute yourself, thank you.
I'm struck by what the previous directors have said, and one of the comments in the chat box from Eleanor Jackson It says that the problem with our home church is that it's dominated by elderly, white, middle-class males. So it reflects, that's what is reflected in our ecumenical movement, that kind of leadership. I would hope that we would take more time to dig deeper into what we read in our biblical understandings, that and to determine what is our current, what is cultural, what are the cultural restrictions that may be different from God's restrictions. Does God have any restrictions on any of us based on our color, our status in life, our gender? And I would say no. And so some of those restrictions are cultural and regional. And how can we get God's message across to put that aside so that all are welcomed?
Thank you, Eleonora. And Matthews George, some comments before we go to the second phase?
Well, Sekma, although some of these comments or questions are very relevant, I would say that this should be reflected upon the current programmatic thrust of CCIA and WCC. And as a former director, I don't think that I should not venture at this stage to respond to some of these things, because the commissioners, those who are participating, and also the staff members, those who are participating, are in a better position to answer precisely to some of these questions. That is what I feel at this stage.
Okay, thank you, Matthews. More questions are coming up, but I think we should still go to the second phase of our program, because time is, we're a little bit behind time. So maybe we can go to the section on human rights and start with Thomas.
Okay, thank you, Segma. Well, this is a quite timely question, given what is going on in Brazil today, as the president has called for his supporters to protest against the Supreme Court and other democratic institutions. So unfortunately, it's a timely question. During the period of military dictatorships in Latin America, the WCC strongly advocated for human rights in the region. For example, the WCC stored documents about human rights abuses in Brazil, which were returned to the country some years ago. Recently, right-wing extremism has been on the rise in Brazil, and it has been associated with conservative churches, environmental degradation, and pandemic denial. How do you see, this question goes to Dwayne, how do you see the role of the ecumenical movement and local churches in these contexts?
Thank you, Thomas, very much for the question. I think that the thing that strikes me most about the churches and human rights today is the abandonment by the member churches of their positions, not of their positions, but of their structures and programs on human rights, someplace in the mid-1980s. During the 1970s and up to the mid-80s, maybe even to the end of the 80s, many churches, many ecumenical organizations, regional and national, had human rights programs. Member churches had budgets that were developed for work in solidarity with partners in other parts of the world who needed help and support. Those were abandoned for other issues, and sometimes for nothing at all. And it's striking to me that has happened. I hope very much that there will be a return to some kind of structural response to the needs of human rights. There is a strong basis for action here, and a strong basis for public awareness building in what has been done in the 70s and up through the 80s, and the experience of working particularly in Latin America, but also in Asia and different parts of Asia, that need to be applied. But I was dismayed at how quickly what was a universal concern of the ecumenical movement in the 70s and 80s just sort of slipped into nothing in terms of the position of in the priorities of the member churches and of many ecumenical organizations. Then I might add just simply that, of course, the general situation of churches in the ecumenical movement and outside the ecumenical movement is quite different now than it was in those years. The church's role in the process of governance in their respective societies has diminished. And their social role in very many societies has been weakened. So I don't know how one deals with that, but I'm encouraged to see some retaking of this in a number of churches, particularly in my own region in the United States. I'm so encouraged to see the re-strengthening and the re-empowerment of the National Council of Churches and its leadership in these days, and its focus on human rights and related concerns.
So that's still on human rights. Can you say a bit why the CCIA decided to statelessness, including the deprivation of nationality as a tool to discriminate and exclude from the nation entire group on the basis of ethnic, religion, or linguistic motive to match you?
To me? Hello?
Yes.
Yes.
Hello. I was
Yeah.
asking that still on human rights.
Okay, well,
You say
the question you are raising on to say a little bit about the work which was started by CCIA on statelessness. When I look back, I would say that it was actually a very timely decision of the CCIA Commission. I remember that the first time it was discussed at the 50th CCIA Commission meeting that was held in Albania. That was in 2010. Historically and traditionally, as we all know, that CCIA or WCC has been discussing and concerned about the issues related with the uprooted people. That was refugees, then internally displaced people, migrants and migrant workers. But in 2010, when we were trying to identify some of the specific program areas and the new programmatic thrust, that was the time that this issue came up. In fact, that was based on the discussions related with the director's report to the 50th CCIA Commission meeting. Well, at that time, we could not fully agree on this. Then this was actually delegated to the further decision and discussion at the specific working group which deals with the migrants and migrant workers. Then, of course, the importance was again underscored during that particular discussion. And then, of course, even we could even change the name of that working group on migration, migrant workers, and stateless people. The first consultation, I remember that we could organize at that time focusing on the Rohingya issues. Actually, the Rohingya issues was not that prominent at that particular period in 2010 or 2011, just as it is now very prominent. And the first consultation was organized in Dhaka in Bangladesh, focusing mainly on the stateless people in the Asian context. Subsequently, we expanded the scope of it and we tried to understand and analyze and also to do the advocacy related with the stateless people in several other contexts. And the second international consultation that was held in Washington, DC in 2013, I remember that prior to the Busan Assembly. I am very glad that today this program has actually gained more importance. Of course, the statelessness has become a major concern and a major issue, not only in Asia, in several other parts of the world. And also, I would like to add that this program is very well organized, and also it has gained international attention because of the committed and active work of my former colleague Ccia. Ccia is so passionate now to address the concerns through various international fora these days. And also I have been following some of these initiatives and activities in which WCC and Ccia has been focusing during this time. So in that way, I am very glad that CCIA Commission's decision in 2010 was very apt and very timely. And of course, now we have we could reach many things during this past 10 years or more than a little bit more than 10 years of time. I am very glad to follow some of these activities of CCIA these days.
Thank you, dear Matthews. And as we talk about human rights and the dignity and equality of all human beings, I do want to bring up the issue of disability inclusion and accessibility, which has been a core part of CCIA's agenda, particularly to the Ecumenical Disability Advocates Network, EDAN. Generally, in our societies and our churches, disability inclusion has largely fallen off the agenda, has been added as an afterthought, or at best been defined in relation to charity, instead of really understanding it as fertile ground for ingenuity and future-proofing our churches, our societies, and our communities. And it sometimes almost seems like the greatest historical oversight, because if you go back and you see how over the decades, the experience and designs of people with disabilities have shaped innovations that have ultimately benefited all. So there are examples like the first typewriter, which was invented to help a blind woman write, the precursor of email, which was invented for a deaf couple to communicate, the remote control for people with limited mobility, to what I'm actually seeing here today on Zoom, the blurred background option that you have. I see you, Peter Proof, having it turned on actually. That was initially created to facilitate sign language communication. And again, disabled people have fueled innovation through principles of universal design that work for all. So my question is, using these principles of universal design, how can the CCIA help fit disability inclusion from somewhat a charitable model to move churches to really hardwire universal design in their practice and their output, and seeing how through that approach we can actually achieve a more just future and vision that we share in CCIA. I want to turn to the two Peters on our panel. Peter Widerwood, turning to you first.
Thank you so much. Human rights is often presented in pair with its sister democracy, and they are closely linked. It's not possible to fully enjoy human rights without democracy. Article 21 stipulates that, I quote, everyone has a right to take part in the government of his country directly or through freely chosen representative. And it also calls for periodic and genuine elections. But human rights is different from democracy. While democracy is basically about majority rule, a fuse to ensure that a country or other context cannot be governed against the will of the majority. It does not answer the challenge how to avoid governing against the interests and needs of minorities. We cannot always expect the majority to be nice, to be tolerant and inclusive, and that is why we need human rights. It is a framework of civilization, putting boundaries on majority ruling, hence a protective fence against populist polarization and protectionism, the main expression of the current right-wing nationalist Peter Proe was referring to earlier. Human rights are universal. They apply to everyone everywhere, but they are also indivisible. They are one. We can stand up for one set of people. When we stand up for one set of rights, we stand up for every right. I see human rights as like an old house protected as heritage. We are not allowed to demolish anything. We can only add. We can add a new floor. We can add some paint, a little repair, while making sure not to take away what has been achieved before. I remember going on the subway in Stockholm some years ago, and opposite me sat one transvestite and one young woman with hijab, and they were facing each other. At a stop, entered a group of aggressive skinheads. Although the two had little in common, both knew that they were hated by the skinheads and possible targets. The quick exchange between the two showed that they suddenly became one. I support you if you cover for me. They were protected by the very same rights. And I think the approach for people with disabilities is to work with others and support the full concept of human rights, contributing to renovation of the house.
Thank you, Peter. Turning to you, Peter Proe, can you help us answer the role of CCIA on disability inclusion?
Sure. Well, maybe not, Melisande, because as you know, in CCIA and WCC in general, we certainly can't claim to be leaders in the field of technological innovation, whether for people with disabilities or for any other sector. But we can claim, and this connects with Peter Vederud's response, we can claim to be leaders in the promotion of the equal God-given dignity and rights of every human being, regardless of disability or any other ground. Now, we are very proud of the WCC associated program, the Ecumenical Disability Advocates Network, or EDAN, which has enabled people with disabilities to take the lead for full inclusion in church and society. Indeed, it has provided a platform for some such leaders to go on to even wider leadership roles, such as Dr. Sam Kabue, former head of EDAN and now a member of the UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And we are also proud of the very important role played by current and former members of CCIA who live with disabilities. We have witnessed in the context of CCIA's work the critical importance of technological aids, some simple, some highly advanced, to enable them to offer their contributions and to take leadership in our work. So we can testify to the importance of technology and universal design for disability inclusion for our churches and for our societies as a whole. So we hope to continue to make that case, not only in abstract policy contexts, but in our life and work in practice. And we would welcome partners with the relevant expertise in design and technology to come alongside us in this task. Thanks.
Well, let's turn to freedom of religion and belief. Well, CCIA first director, Dr. Frederick Node, was instrumental in the drafting of the Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights on freedom of religion and belief. In current times of rising extremisms, including Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, Christianophobia, etc., hate speech and populist rhetoric, how would you, directors, see the freedom of religion and belief today? And what role can CCIA play in this context? I would like to hear first from Peter Vederud and then from Reverend Giddens-Ivory. Peter first, please.
Well, thank you, Dr. Thomas. I mean, freedom of religion or belief as part of human rights is holding three principles of relation between state and religion together. The first principle is freedom to religion. Everyone has the right to exercise his own faith together with others. And the second principle is freedom from religion. And everyone has the right not to be influenced by religious indoctrination against his or her own will. And the third is a principle of freedom to choose. All faithful individuals must be treated equally and with the same respect. Majority and minority must be treated with the same standard, and the state must be neutral. Freedom of religion and belief as part of human right is not only an important principle to preach, to promote, and to defend. It's also an invitation to dialogue between different perspectives. It's an invitation to observe the state as secular, but not the society. It's an invitation to appreciate diversity, accepting the rationale that pluralism in society is economically more prosperous, culturally more stimulating, and ultimately also more fun. It is an invitation to go beyond tolerance, more than suffer the presence of the other. It's an invitation to love, respect, and care for your neighbor. And the main threat to foreign is growing intolerance, as we have mentioned several times today, from majorities to minorities, a tendency to claim their own culture to be superior to others. We see growing intolerance, authoritarian populism, and sectarian approaches, and there is no major difference between Muslims and Christians. We see it in both cultures, so to speak. Many conflicts have religious elements in them without being religious at the roots. Conflicts are about power, about land, about resources, but religion is about identity. It says something of who you are and also who you are not. And that is important in conflicts, and to define who is with us and who is not. Hence, religion can often be used in conflicts and fuel them. But for this to happen, we need both political leaders who invite the religious aspect for polarization, and we need religious leaders who accept this invitation. And I'll say the role of CCIA has always been to vaccinate against such invitation, to make church leaders solid in their approach, that they will not accept this invitation, not in my name. And fourth, with these three aspects, I would say is the effective vaccine against the virus of intolerance. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Reverend Giddens Ivory, if you'd like to add up.
Yes, the freedom of religion and belief on the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights is needed now more than ever. As our populations are relocating all throughout the world, we are faced with various religious practices that our neighbors may have, what they may practice, that these are unfamiliar to us. This Declaration on Human Rights gives us an approach to put these various ways of seeing God and living as God would have us live into context. This is the context, the overarching structure that we are to look at as we work toward tolerance. We must learn to be more tolerant and less judgmental. We will not all pray in the same fashion. Hopefully, we can come to understand to be more tolerant based on the fact that most of us believe that there is just one God. But we may have different ways of getting to that one God. Our goal is to pray that everyone can find God peacefully without judging the way that another person may come to God. My understanding of God should not be threatened by another person's understanding of God. And my understanding of God may even be strengthened by another person's understanding of God. So let us all understand God and flourish and blossom and be enhanced with justice sustaining faith in that one God. Amen. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend. Let's move to peace building portrayed context of conflict. We have 3 questions, and we're going to ask Peter Weiderud, Matthew George, and Peter Proof to answer one of these 3 questions. So here goes the first question. The WCC has had a fundamental role on the dialogue between churches in both sides of the Korean Peninsula since at least the Tosanso consultation in 1984. How do you see the evolution of peacemaking efforts and the role of the WCC and Korean churches since then? If one of you, Peter Matthews or Peter Bruce,
Well, let me defer to Matthews on this one.
Sorry. Well, CCIA has been taking this initiative with regard to the Tosanso process starting from 1984, which you have mentioned. Since then, the World Council of Churches provided the opportunity and provided the platforms for the churches and the church leaders from both countries, from North and South Korea, to meet together. I remember that when I was a steward at the Moscow WCC Central Committee, where the church leaders from these two countries, they came together and they were celebrating their joy in a particular plenary session and also another evening. And since then, WCC provided number of opportunities through the Gleon consultations, and the Tosanso process was followed up by different commissions and different commission meetings. And also only those days, only the World Council of Churches only could provide that kind of opportunity for the people from both North and South Korea to meet in a common platform. That was a very, very unique contribution of the World Council of Churches, and especially through the initiative of the CCIA Commission. And in that way, still that process is still being continued. And now more opportunities are there. Of course, WCC has expanded the network, not only limiting this involvement only within the CCIA Commission's framework, but WCC started and CCIA Commission has started including several other ecumenical partners and churches from different parts of the world through this ecumenical platform, which was created in with the help of the German churches in a meeting held in Arnoldstein in 2008. That meeting, that was actually the beginning of the EFK, Ecumenical Forum on Peace and Reconciliation on the Korean Peninsula. And also in that way, now that platform has been expanded and more opportunities are provided, not only providing this humanitarian aid assistance little bit, but more in advocacy. And one of the recent initiatives of WCC, especially addressing this statement and letter to the US President, that itself shows that in that way, the World Council of Churches can still demonstrate its leadership and also to include and also broaden the network and provide this wider platform for a future advocacy. That is one of the unique contributions of CCIA when it is compared with the work of several other ecclesiastical bodies or churches. In that way, CCIA was the pioneer with regard to the work of the North and South Korea peace and reconciliation process and the advocacy initiatives during the past several years.
Thank you, Matthews. And still on the question of protracted conflicts, how has CCIA handled the situation with West Papua over the last decades? I'll ask Peter Prove if you.
Thank you, Reverend Seppi. Yeah, just before I come to that question, just a brief addition to what Matthews has said. Insofar as our work on the Korean Peninsula is very much based on people-to-people encounter, the COVID pandemic and the lockdowns have been a major obstacle to pursuing that. So we have found other ways during that period to express solidarity through online events, but there's no substitute for the face-to-face encounter that we seek to facilitate and engage in. So we're desperately hoping for those opportunities to emerge again. On West Papua, the WCC has actually had quite a long history, a very long history of raising the concerns of the people, particularly the indigenous Papuans. And there have been several visits to the territory by WCC general secretaries and staff over the years. But as one of the most significant recent events, I just want to highlight the delegation visit that we took to West Papua in February 2019, immediately prior to the CCIA meeting that then took place in Indonesia. And this delegation comprised 21 people. It was the largest international delegation of any kind ever to have visited the territory since it came under Indonesian control in 1969. We visited several places in West Papua, and we witnessed again the many dimensions of the crisis in Papua, particularly as it affects indigenous Papuans. Our main focus right now is to demand more openness and more transparency by the Indonesian government, which keeps this crisis invisible to the international community. Most people around the world don't even know that West Papua is something other than Papua New Guinea. We first have to raise awareness. We have to require of the Indonesian government access to the territory for international humanitarian organizations, for human rights experts, and for journalists. And that's what we're working on right now.
Thank you very much, Peter. I see that Adebayo has left, but he had one question about the Middle East, and actually it was for Peter Weiderud. He was asking, how would you describe the peace-building efforts of CCIA for just and inclusive societies in the Middle East over the past 75 years? Peter, if you could very briefly say, because we're really out of time, thank you so much.
Thank you. I will very briefly then focus on the Arab-Israeli conflict. Church of Sweden was one of the hosts of the WCC General Assembly in Uppsala in 1968, and this was the first time in a larger international setting that Palestinian leaders were heard with their national claims. They came well prepared, and that changed both my church and my country. Before Uppsala, the Palestinian issue was a refugee issue, and after it was an issue about occupation, liberation, and national rights. In 1968, the Palestinian struggle was a traditional liberation struggle with different means. That approach ended in December 1988, when the PLO chairman Yasser Arafat in the UN General Assembly recognized Israel's 67 borders and renounced terrorism. And then the Palestinian strategy changed to negotiations with Israel for a two-state solution of the conflict. That strategy peaked with the Oslo Accords in 1993, but lost steam after the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin in 1995. There was no serious counterpart to negotiate with. And the present strategy to seek recognition of a Palestinian state through international law has gradually developed after realizing that the other two will not deliver. And the Palestinian state will gradually develop through UN membership and recognition by different states. The CCIA has been in solidarity with Palestinians in all strategies, with a strict commitment only to nonviolent means, and will continue to be so, I hope. I believe that follows the wisdom of the UN Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld, who died 60 years ago in September. He said, constant attention by a good nurse may be just as important as a major operation by a surgeon. I'm extremely happy that the ecumenical accompanying program that we started during my time in the CCIA is still working and still developing. Still, I believe we should do more. And I would like to wish for an ecumenical campaign for recognition of a Palestinian state. The Swedish government recognized Palestine in 2014, and I can see clear policy links between the WCC General Assembly in Uppsala in 1968 and this.
Thank you, Peter. Now the last question, it's on climate change, and very quickly, with 1 minute, if Peter Prue can just share with us what has been the work of the CCIA in terms of addressing climate change, especially for us in the Pacific, where this is one of our major challenges. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend Seppi. I had a long answer for you on this question. I'll give you the brief version, but we will have to talk about this separately. You know, of course, the WCC has been in the vanguard of efforts for international attention and action on climate change for more than 40 years. And the experience of the most vulnerable people and communities, including especially those in low-lying island states in the Pacific and elsewhere, have been a key reference point and driver of that advocacy. The role of Reverend John Doom was mentioned earlier in this webinar. Actually, the most recent meeting of the full commission of CCIA, which happened just before the pandemic lockdowns, took place in Brisbane, my hometown, in Australia in February 2020. The original plan was that we were going to go and visit, prior to that meeting, the Solomon Islands, where one of our commissioners lives, in order to see exactly this, the impact of climate change on people and communities there. Unfortunately, we couldn't because of the lockdowns that were emerging at that time. But the issue of climate change was the most prominent issue in that meeting in that region, because of what we learned from participants from the Pacific, including Reverend James Bagwan, General Secretary of the Pacific Conference of Churches who participated, but also because of the context in Australia of the most catastrophic bushfires that the country had ever experienced having just taken place. So we were very marked by that. And now, with the accelerating climate emergency having once again been dramatized for us by the latest IPCC report, and with the proliferation of extreme weather events around the world, it is time finally for the world not only to listen to the voices of the people of the Pacific or other vulnerable communities, but to take the necessary society and economy changing actions to actually avoid the worst consequences of climate change. It's our #1 challenge facing the world today, and we all have to do something to change this trajectory. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you very much, all panelists, directors, commissioners, for this very rich and insightful conversation that allowed us to learn and reminisce from the past, understand better the present challenges, and also envision the future. If it wasn't for the pandemic, this would have warranted a face-to-face meeting during which we would have discussed in much more depth several of these issues that we barely touched upon today. So this is why we're hoping to organize other webinars before the end of the year to commemorate this anniversary, and hopefully, for instance, a webinar bringing together the moderators of the CCIA. I would like to close by asking Dr. Isabel Apao-Firi to make some closing remarks to end the session. She is a Presbyterian from Malawi. She is the Deputy General Secretary of the World Council of Churches for Public Witness and Diaconia since 2012. She also gives oversight to the WCC Pilgrimage of Justice and Peace, as well as WCC's work on human sexuality, just community of women and men, and overcoming racism. She received her Bachelor of Education from the University of Malawi and holds a master's degree in religious education from the University of Lancaster, England, and a doctorate in religious studies from the University of Cape Town, South Africa. Dr. Firi.
Thank you so much, Segma. I just want to echo what you have said at the end, that really it would have been good if we had more time to discuss, the several issues that were raised, during this discussion. 90 minutes was not enough to do justice to the work of CCIA. And this webinar has showed us that, during the last 75 years, CCIA has been working on a wide range of issues. And as we listened, to the different speakers, we could see how this program has become wider and wider. But unfortunately, the number of staff has become narrower and narrower. And maybe that's another area which we didn't touch at all. But what I noticed is that within the WCC, we also have experts in the areas that have been mentioned here, right? Areas of health and healing, economic justice, migration, gender justice, disarmament, issues of racism, disabilities, peace building. And it would have been good also to hear how we are working together in an integrated way to make sure that, we are supporting the work of CCIA, and CCIA is also supporting the work of the WCC in other areas. And another thing that I have noted is that, we are hoping that our constituency will continue to see in the CCIA as a tool they can use to raise their voices and profile in non-ecclesial circles. As a Christian family, we will always continue to stress the importance of protecting and upholding human rights as a whole, because as an ecumenical family, we affirm clearly that every individual bears the image of God and therefore deserves respect and protection. It is our Christian vocation to speak out prophetically on belief of those, on behalf of those who have, on behalf of those who are voiceless, oppressed, or denied in their fundamental human rights. And it would also be nice, for us to look at those controversial issues where even within the WCC, we don't speak with one voice, but they are human rights issues, which are very important to be addressed, by all of us as a community. And lastly, I want to thank my colleagues, who have organized this webinar, in particular, Segma and Peter. And I also want to thank you for choosing this methodology of intergenerational discussion. It was excellent. And I want to thank all the presenters and all those who have participated in this webinar. So thank you to everyone.